Okay, I'm starting the stream to Gather. We're live on Gather. Yay for us.
Hello, hello. Okay, yeah, that works.
Yeah, sounds good. So for all the participants who are online, I'm going to put an order of presentation for each of you to give your short spiel at the beginning. We're going to do everybody who's online first, and here's our order. I'm just going to place that in the chat so you can see it, but I will, of course, when we introduce everyone here in a moment, we'll go over this again.
Starting. Oh, Bernie, come here.
Oh.
Bernie's in his room.
Oh, okay. Bernie, if you're joining from the from online as well, you'll be just after Chris Ball here. So that's the rest. We thought that two of you were going to be in the room itself to present. But anyway, this will be the order of presentation as we go around for the first round. And then, of course, we'll have time to start discussing with each other as well.
I mean, I could go downstairs and join in person if that's preferable.
No, it's completely up to you. This is the beauty of having the hybrid. So you can be wherever you want to be.
I guess you can.
So is Laurie the only one in person?
Besides, yeah, and that's why I want you to come down.
All right.
Oh, she wants you to come down.
I'll be right down.
Okay.
Yeah, come on down.
Your own very special.
Okay. Well, for me and Bernie and Jan also.
Yeah, well, and everybody else who's
Yeah.
The handheld is best for passing around and making commentary, but if you need to read something, then
Yeah,
we use this.
okay.
Yes, exactly. So you and Bernie and I, we
But you don't have it turned on.
It is not on, right?
Okay, good. So we can say whatever we want for
In theory, they can hear you through the other one.
yeah, right, yeah. Bernie's coming down. People aren't supposed to, we would love you to sit in these chairs here. Yeah. Be part of the circle.
have this in here too.
Should we all do that? No, I don't want to do that because my.
No.
what I-
It's just so I can monitor the chat.
Okay, all right, good idea. Yeah,
Yes, wonderful.
let's wait till Bernie gets here. He's on his way.
Yeah, of course. We're gonna wait for Bernie and maybe some other people are gonna.
Yeah,
Oh, it's just one. Oh, one.
yeah.
So
Things have really been starting. Yesterday, when the keynote started.
yeah. So just to let you know, we're gonna wait another couple of minutes. Things have been running late here in Boulder, so thank you for your patience.
So what's the order, Jan? Is there an order?
Yeah, I'll announce it in the beginning.
Okay.
The order should not switch back and forth too much between online and in person. We'll do the online participants first, and then Bernie, and then you,
Okay.
and then open it to the
Okay, great. Okay, good.
I'm Hannah for a long time. Hi. So,
Laurie, you want to go?
Oh, I've got
Oh, you've got
some
it.
water
Okay.
here. But yeah, go ahead and
Yeah.
give me it because I may finish what I have. put it under my seat or under the seat.
2 minutes that you're up
No,
and running.
we're waiting a little bit. Okay, that's
There's
great.
a resolution, and when we did it at Iowa, it was before the divest oil has now become part of it. And so I'd be happy to send you ours and the materials that we presented for our guidance council and, basically, because TIA to a faculty council meeting. Yeah, we had the NGOs involved with a coalition of NGOs and working to bring in more and more universities. And we were really the first one after Wisconsin. There was a lot. It took us 2 years and it was they're getting, you know, and you know, they told TIA came and presented their side. And then after we passed it over, he was one of them last night. And they're not interested in, I believe, in grassroots pressure. So I shortlisted the bibliography. And ours are
Welcome.
I think Perley's gonna want to see it. But anyway, yeah, email me and.
So it's
We decided no.
It's on the Zoom link.
Yeah, I know. We have, unfortunately, most people bail out in person.
Yeah.
What I found at Iowa, first it was me, and then I found
But given our technology,
Which,
Wade team that shepherded this to the faculty.
so we're gonna start. Everybody online
It had more
with their spiel first,
And then
and
we
then Laurie.
started to divest.
And
So we don't, we're not pushing to divest.
then
It's pressuring TIA to change. Because TIA, they're all doing this. Right. TIA is just the biggest, and it has the very slick HR, promo material and stuff. So it's not divest. It's like, we're a voice, and we want you to stop it.
so this
Yeah.
one and this and her.
Has found that.
So
Yeah.
this is, yeah. Yeah. Anyhow,
Yeah,
so you
no,
can
it's
actually
amazing.
do it easier because Laurie wanted the computer. So she has good.
Complain, no, they set up their hotline.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if you know the feminist.
Precisely the strategy that our institution, it's those dual hits, run out the clock, set out some
Yeah.
divergent complaint things so that it can be fun.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think it'd be a great.
I've been wanting to write something for like the.
Okay, our technical
Yeah,
staff.
that'd be
So-
perfect. Yeah, thank you.
So Bernie's gonna go before me. Is he just gonna move over here when it's?
He doesn't, he just uses.
Oh,
just
okay.
uses,
All right.
um,
Thanks for coming down, Bernie.
no, I saw the Zoom link and I thought.
Okay. We're good? Make sure I'm talking to the mic. Wonderful. Okay, then I will start by welcoming you all to our session Language Imperfect, a roundtable on ontological linguistic difference. My name is Jan Hauck. I'm from the London School of Economics and also from UCLA. And my co-organizer is joining us remotely on this screen here, Jenanne Ferguson from McEwan University. We're both very pleased to have such a distinguished group of colleagues and roundtable presenters. Hello? Oh. We are joined remotely by Sinfree Makoni from Pennsylvania State University, Paul Kroskrity from UCLA, Sean O'Neill, University of Oklahoma, Janet Chernela from the University of Maryland, Rosaline Howard from Newcastle University, Suzanne Oakdale from the University of New Mexico, and Christopher Ball from the University of Notre Dame. And in the room, we are joined by our colleagues, Bernard Perley from the University of British Columbia, also our SLA president, and Laurie Graham from the University of Iowa. And of course, everyone else here in the room, and I do hope that we can engage in a lively discussion later on. So what brings us together here is to interrogate ontological difference of language, difference in what language is. The label language imperfect is designed to capture, on the one hand, that we may not know perfectly what language is, and on the other, that there is a potential for language to be otherwise. In preparation for the session, we circulated 2 papers that were also linked in the program, which I hope you all saw. Each of the presenters will respond directly to these. One is a paper by Eugenia De Muro and Laura Gurney entitled Languaging as World Making, the ontological basis for language, and published last year. And the other one, a working paper, Language Otherwise, Linguistic Natures and the Ontological Challenge, which I wrote for this occasion. We hope most of you will have read them. If not, we'll briefly summarize them here in the beginning for those who might have missed the link. So to begin with my own paper, Language Otherwise, as linguistic anthropologists, we've been critical of the notion of language for a long time, pointing out that it rests on unexamined philosophical assumptions, manifests in standard language ideologies, linguistic purism or essentialism, that enable deficit views of non-standard varieties. So far, our critical strategies have mostly been either abandoning the concept as too narrow, or conversely expanding it. Either we disinvent language, recognizing language or languages don't exist. And when I say language, I do mean here language in both of its senses in English, in language in general, or language as a type, and then particular languages as its tokens. But on both of these levels, we try to advocate for using other languages, such as languaging, other concepts such as languaging or discourse and the like. Alternatively, we argue for expanding what we take language to be, including so-called paralinguistic features, multimodality, gesture, embodiment, etc. But also, so on the level of language in general, but also expanding what we take particular languages to mean. Notions such as hybridity, heteroglossia, etc. address this level. So while these strategies have, of course, been very useful, in most cases, we have already made up our minds about what language is. Language is a human practice. Language is a set of communicative resources or social construction. And also, we've made up our minds about what language is not. It's not a module in the brain. It's not an essence tied to blood, soil, race, and the like. While we, of course, have good reasons for taking language, for these assumptions, for taking language in these ways, and like for rejecting some of these assumptions, they may not necessarily correspond to the assumptions of our interlocutors at our field sites. So we are often at a loss when we encounter claims such as that language is a kind of bodily essence, or that language is not what separates humans from non-humans, or that a specific language must be kept pure. So the question that we're posing is, could it be that these disjunctures may not just point to different beliefs that different people have about the same thing, language, but perhaps they may hint at more fundamental misunderstandings about what language is. In recent years, an increasing number of scholars has begun to ask ontological questions about language and languages. My own approach, which I've developed together with my colleague Guilherme Heurich from the University College London, proposes the concept of linguistic natures, the natures of language, to tackle this issue, taking inspiration from one version of the ontological term. Our approach neither tries to abandon the concept of language, saying like certain people don't have language or the language concept doesn't apply in a given context, nor do we try to expand it so that it kind of could include anything that potentially could be language. But what we're trying to do is take seriously claims that we encounter in our fieldwork and to try to understand what they may entail, acknowledging that there may be ontological differences in what we usually, and perhaps too quickly, translate as language. So for instance, in the work of my co-organizer, Jenanne Ferguson, the Sakha in Siberia recognized language to have a spirit and agency of its own. As Janet Chernela has shown in her work in the Upper Rio Negro region in the Amazon, language is taken to be a kind of bodily essence, which determines who you can or cannot marry, which is, in the literature is known as linguistic exogamy. Other groups, such as the Mapuche in Chile, recognize ontological differences between different languages, between Spanish, the language of white people, and Mapudungun, the language of the land, which is connected to the vital force that animates being. And there might also be ontological differences between everyday speech and certain ritual languages that have a certain power, and it may enable communication with all kinds of non-humans. Thinking with such ontological differences means an invitation to pause, to bracket our own ontological certainties about language and learn to listen to others, to forego a priori assumptions of what language is and remain open to language otherwise. With this, I will now turn the virtual floor, first over to Jenanne to introduce the second paper. To avoid having to switch back and forth, we'll first go through our panelists in the virtual space and then turn to our colleagues here on the floor, and then we'll open the roundtable to a general discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. So we had originally been talking a couple of years ago about the ways that we were each trying to approach the question of ontologies of language or language ontologies in our own work. And we'd both sort of been working on this idea, but hadn't really had a chance to discuss it with each other. We were coming to these conclusions quite separately. And we had a chat and realized that, we weren't necessarily completely sold on the current terminology that was being used to discuss these, to discuss the issue, but we were both deeply interested in, again, what are the uses of thinking about language in this way? How is this useful? Is this a thing that we want to continue doing? What do other people think about this? What kinds of different, again, ethnographic examples can we draw from in understanding the different ways that we might use this kind of ontological framework to understand difference? So we wanted to give you a chance to read what some other scholars were saying as well, and we chose the other paper because it was very much an overview of what people in other fields and other research sites were saying. And in that paper, they survey literature from not only anthropology and linguistics, but from psychology and philosophy and other fields as well, indigenous studies, numerous others, to better have an idea of exactly what kinds of tropes are we finding when we take a broader view. So what Demeraux and Gurney come up with is that language ontologies are worlded, and worlding is a verb, and that essentially languages create worlds through their practices, and they categorize three sort of broad ontologies of language: language as object, language as practice, and language as assemblage. And so we had assigned, again, these two papers to give, again, sort of surveys of different ideas that people are bringing to the table at this point in the conversation. And we wanted to bring you all together because we felt that each of your works could, and your approaches could provide really valuable insights into how we can go about thinking this. So I won't belabor the particular points of that paper any further. It's a good read for any of you in the audience too. If you're new to this subject, it's something that I think covers a lot of the various issues that are happening around this. So with that, then we will start by going around to each of our presenters and giving you each around 5 minutes or so to present your case and your thoughts. After we do that, we'll go to Bernie and Laurie, who are there in person for their presentations, and then we'll start opening this up to questions. After all of the presenters, I'll let everyone online know how to go about posing a question. So I'll leave that for now. And without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Sinfree Makoni from Pennsylvania State University, who will be our first speaker. I will let you know when you're at about 4 minutes. I'll give a quick interruption just to let you know how you're doing for time. We do have a fair amount of time though, so don't panic too much yet. You don't need to rush. Sound good?
How many minutes do I have?
5-ish.
5. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. I'm going to try and approach the issues about language ontology from the perspective of Southern epistemologies. And this is the narrative that I'm going to give. Southern epistemologies and indigenous ontologies should help us to understand. My focus, is likely to be on African studies and then anthropology from multiple perspectives, leading us to use metaphors and narratives in our analysis. An example of a shift in the geography of reason is apparent if we shift from thinking about language from using land-based ontologies to water-based ontologies. Such a shift is important, is an important potential line of inquiry, because water shapes our conceptual images of language in the global South. It is important to consider water because what we think water is has an impact on how we shape and treat it as well, and how we frame language. It is relevant to frame language ontologically using water, because the planet is largely water, and every one of us is approximately 80% water. Thus, water is not out there, it is in us. Critical perspectives can be gained by taking the ocean's liquidity seriously. Nevertheless, we are also aware of the limitations of such ontologies. We question the premise of wet ontology vision, particularly the distinction between water and land. For the ocean is not simply liquid, it is also solid, ice, and air. It generates winds which transport smells, and these may travel the oceanic miles inland. Although early attention to the ocean's liquidity was a necessary antidote to superficial ontology, we take the discussion further by exploring what emerges if instead we were to approach the ocean as offering more than wet ontology, liquid materiality, wherein its fluid nature is continuously produced and dissipated. Wet ontology affects how we frame language ontologically, but as Brown and Humberston 2015 remarked, diverse approaches to writing about or of the sea shape the way we engage with the sea and our relationship with the sea. In other words, wet ontology in Southern ontologies helps us to understand notions about seanesses or oceannesses. In their book, Sing Like a City, Amin and Thrift urge us to take seriously the heterogeneity and complexity of the sea, of the city, a call that we extend to language and communication. Southern theorists working from epistemologies of the South try to see language in the city through the lenses of untangling bundles of electric wires, assorted cables, and water pipes attached to houses, as Big 2021 puts it. Following cables makes us change perspective about language. As we go along, assorted and entangled cables create coherence for their very rhizomatic discourses. Yet there is no one story in the received, yet there is no one story in the received, since no one single narrative or discourse from these cables can be able to capture what is taking place. Cables have neither a beginning nor an end, a departure or arrival, origin or destination, only a discernible middle. The image of cables with neither beginnings nor ends, but only middles, has implications for domains in sociolinguistics in the global South, such as second language acquisition, language testing, and language teaching. The idea of cables as an ontological frame helps us to understand that it's only the middle that we are familiar with. Much of the recent anthropological research on Africa and other Southern ontologies.
One more minute.
Okay, thank you very much. Cities are not likely to think in the same way as human beings. We can be certain of that, but it is unlikely that the Western human modes of thought and indeed human modes of languaging exhaust all possibilities of thinking about language. So Southern theory is seeking to open new ways of thinking about language. And let me just then close this. Within the Southern theory, orientations we are seeking to develop are multiple ontologies that are not only different, that not only are they different kinds of Southern multilingualisms, but that involve interwoven language resources. Language is not peculiar and unique to human beings in Southern ontologies. It is a property of human beings that they share with inanimate objects. For example, besides the communicative uses of curved pot leads from the Lower Congo as examples of speaking objects. Each of these pot leads represents one or more proverbs or tales that together signify complex messages in interpersonal communication, frequently relating to a wedding or a marriage. And I conclude, it is these types of explorations, it is these types of language use that enable us to believe that language is not human specific. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move now then to Dr. Paul Kroskrity from UCLA. And again, I will just let you know when you're at about 4 minutes, but go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you, Jan and Jenanne, for inviting me to this session here. I'm going to do this much more conversationally. It probably would be appropriate given where my thoughts are in terms of engaging this. And I want to situate where I'm coming from in terms of the projects that I'm trying to do. I'm dealing both with the history of how ontology relates to language ideologies, but also with the two very diverse communities that I've worked with over the years, the Western Mono of Central California and the village of Tewa in northern Arizona, two groups that have rather distinct, I would say, both ontologies of languages and many different ideologies of language as well, and different circumstances in which they operate. I'm concerned with seeing the ontological turn as a valuable extension of the language ideology approach. My personal attraction to language ideologies back in the early days of the formation of this group, of this paradigm kind of thing, was really in part because it opened up the possibility of thinking about very different conceptions of the way language was. And I've talked about the Tewa as having notions of language that really were not limited to the sort of like oral features of language, but also included nonverbal communication, multimodal things, and so on and so forth. So I think I've always been interested in that aspect of it. And I think that ontological diversity in languages has always been a driving force, as well as the idea of trying to somehow tie that into a political economic approach as well. What I wanted to turn to is, in some sense, is to think about one of the things that shows up in the paper that's Jan circulated, where he talks about beliefs and feelings as if they were sort of like dealing with two different kinds of things in terms of the dualism between reality and representation. And I think I'm probably as much responsible as anybody in the language ideologies camp for talking about beliefs and sort of like using a very quick and dirty explanation of language ideologies as beliefs and feelings. But I never meant beliefs to be used in that fashion. I've always thought about them as, to some extent, something much more like worldview, and that there were so many of these things that were available, and even multiple worldviews within the same kind of communities. So I think that in some ways that's been a real issue. I've also, this is an opportunity for me to say personally to Jenanne that I really liked your book on the Saka. It's a fantastic book, and I've learned a lot from it. But I do contest the kind of idea that the ontological approach is completely distinct from the ideological. In other words, I think that even ontologies really amount to a kind of approach that really stem from material conditions under which people operate, and also to represent the sort of like perhaps the kind of thing you would expect given the practices in those communities based on their social structure, based on their economic adaptation, based on the religion that is formed to connect them to their lands, and so on and so forth. And I think that all these things, this sort of the nexus of ideational and material worlds, I think are really quite important to look at. So I really see the apparent division between these ontological approaches and ideological approaches, where there has been a contrast made, to be sort of a false one in a way, because I think that a lot of the language ideological work has been overly influenced by work on European languages, by European scholars. And I think for the most part, when you start approaching indigenous languages, all of us who have worked with indigenous languages know there's much more ontological diversity. That's really not been really seen as the mainstay of the language ideological work. But I think it's really always been there. And it's been something that I think this movement toward an ontological turn can help us bring out. I really also, turning to the DeMuro and Gurney article, I really
do. A minute or so.
Okay, I really do love the idea of language ontology as worlded through linguistic practices. And I think for me, this is sort of like fits in with what I've been trying to do in recent years on moving toward language ideological assemblages, like thinking about massive amounts of things that need to be considered at the same time, the total mess of language use in situations where we're dealing with people, with materiality, with projects, with ultimately too with other forms of linguistic becoming. I think that are really really important here, and really I think very critical to get at what is really the great potential of this approach, which is to really start to see the dynamism of language change and the way all change comes out of variation and contestation and so on and so forth. I think the one thing that, and I'll end with this, that I find maybe just a little bit lacking in some of the things that we were reading, was this idea about what happens with these multiple worlds, the multiple ontologies, and to some extent what happens in language context situations where you now have contact of people with very disparate forms of political power and economic resources. And the way that all this ontological diversity that's there in indigenous communities starts to wind up becoming under pressure from what really would be nation state and globalist kinds of ideologies. So I'm a little bit concerned that this is still an unexamined aspect of it, of the turn. And I think something that I would like to see more attention devoted to. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We'll move next now to Dr. Sean O'Neill at the University of Oklahoma.
Microphone wasn't working. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, I better jump in. I had a bit to say, and I had to cut it back, so I wrote it up in this case. Plus, there's a crime scene out my door. I mean, on the street. It got me a little shaken, so I'm going to rip through this. I'm going to try to connect this up a little bit with some of the philosophers and deconstruct the West a little bit. And then I've worked in a lot of communities, and I'm going to make some comparisons. So, for my part, I'd like to focus on how language actually transforms us every time we open our mouths to speak or ears to listen, not just individually, but also collectively. As we take on and embody roles, as we repeat scripts, such as racism in the US, creating real injustices, real hierarchies, real material conditions, as Paul was talking about, real expressions of power. The word, in this sense, becomes flesh, striking us to our marrow, to our very ground of being, ontology in a word. Finally, we may even channel or personify the voices of other species, forming relationships, real or imaginary, with other life forms, animals and plants, sometimes creatures from other planets and folklore around the world, for instance, who may be seen as part of the speech community. Now let me move on to how these transformative experiences, now let me move from these transformative experiences to making ontological claims about the essence of language itself. So I'm starting with experience and then the claims we say afterwards. In the West, for instance, we've had a long-standing fixation with the tongue, in the left brain, by the way, the messenger over the message. Like a finger pointing at the moon, we sometimes miss the moon in our obsession with the finger, looking only at the tongue, the sounds of the structures, while losing the sight, losing sight of the dialogic imagination behind it all. The primary reality for Paul Friedrich of language. We have different views in the West. So many ontologies declaim even in the West, which is far from uniform in philosophy, not isolated from these other global communities throughout the last several millennia. Now let me share some of my experiences from the field and from afar. One of the claims I would like to examine, which crops up around the planet, is the idea that the universe itself was ushered into existence by a primordial act of speech, way beyond Austin. Language, through association with divinity, itself becomes sacred. You can look to the West for that too. So many cases to consider here, starting with Hebrew and Sanskrit, said to intone the original names for things, or said to be infused with the creative spark. Not all the words were there to start. That's a reflection of, divine intelligence. For the Navajo, music enters the picture with sacred songs carrying this divine spark into the present with a healing power. Here, I think we see a reflection of the world-making capacity of speech to project a silver screen in our minds, a virtual reality that we come to inhabit. And perhaps the recognition of the power of language and music to elevate our souls, change our moods, Carlos Santana talks about that, and pass on a framework of mythology that we can literally inhabit, as Roland Barthes says in a political sense. Going from divine gift to the communion with the ancestors, language is often framed as a book of life, as in the Hebrew tradition, or as a series of visions from the past and lessons from the future, which I hear very often, not just about the past, future, a guide to the ancestors and a path forward. So much more than just words and grammar or the tongue. Here, I think we see a recognition of the capacity of speech to transmit legacies going back thousands of years, as we actually know from historical linguistics. And then there's room here for all of the ologies, as I would like to say, going far beyond just ontology, mythology, musicology, pharmacology, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and so on. Plenty of psychological wisdom there too. The full philosopher's handbook in every language passed down and revised over the generations. The last ontological claim, I'm just about done, I want to examine is the idea that there is an inherent musicality to all speech, frequently made around the world. Language flows from music, and music echoes language, a dialogue between the two in every jazz recording. Working with tone languages such as Plains Apache or Cherokee, I would frequently encounter speakers who said things like this: you have to get the song of it, and every word has a little song. While working with Durbin Feeling, the Cherokee linguist, we would spend hours writing words out in the syllabary, which doesn't have tone markings, just like ancient Hebrew didn't have the vowels, and then whistling the melodies, which are harder to capture but essential. You can whistle them out every time. And this musicality is also captured in epic poetry, the Quran, the Torah, probably the Odyssey and the Iliad, and the Navajo Blessing Way ceremony. Perhaps speech reaches its aesthetic high point in music and poetry, but there's always an echo of the poetic, even in prose or mere gossip, all the genres we can include here. And again, there's some consensus from the West, including thinkers like Rousseau and Darwin, or more recently Leonard Bernstein and Roman Jakobson. With this, I'm almost done. With this musicality, there's also the ability to move the audience to an emotional level, even when rendered in the tone of voice of ordinary speech, as we fuse it with music there too, creating a vast community across the generations, which is actually kind of happening, synced up by the very real power of language and music. Let me end by saying that there are grains of profound truth in all of these stories we're hearing today, not just fanciful, folklore. Something for all of us to learn about the nature of language as musings handed down over human history. There's validity and relativity in these insights and room for all of the ologies in the sphere of logos, the word made flesh, ontology, in a very real sense. So I have a little bit more time. I'd also like to mention, if you want, oh no, okay, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you. And again, if you have other things, we can come back to them in the discussion afterwards. We'll give everybody a chance to speak again at the end as well. So hold that thought. Sorry. Thank you very much. Next, we'll move to Dr. Janet Chernela at the University of Maryland. You're still muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. First, I want to thank Jan and Jenanne for sticking with this very good idea. It needed these extra years, perhaps, but we'll see about that. I think some of you are familiar with the Northwest Amazon and the multitude of languages there. Today, what I'm going to stress is the importance of the existence of languages among languages. It's now widely acknowledged that language cannot be reproduced or transmitted without a theory of what language is. In the Northwest Amazon of Brazil and Colombia, where speakers of some 20 indigenous languages of the Eastern Tucanoan family live side by side, such a theory is based not only on interactive practice and ideology, but on ontological assumptions and beliefs that underlie speech practice, influencing language maintenance and contributing to one of the most extreme examples of sustained multilingualism known. I have coined the term alterlects. I think I've coined it, let me know, to explain the way in which everybody in the Northwest Amazon, all speakers of Eastern Tucanoan languages, live in the midst of other languages. This throws into question the very idea of worlding, and I hope we can come back to that. Living within a diverse array of alterlects, and by that I mean other linguistic possibilities that claim the co-equal status of language with a capital L, speakers of Eastern Tucanoan languages subscribe to a theory of what language is and how any single instance as a token fits into an overarching assemblage or type of recognizably like phenomena. As such, the ontological foundations of language create, and I would argue, the polyglossia that is at the center of a vital macro-social communicative economy linked interdiscursively across 35,000 square kilometers and encompassing more than 20,000 speakers. I use the case of the Coteria, one group of Eastern Tucanoans living along the Valpez River in Brazil and Colombia, to think through their notions of what language is and how it fits within a schema of pan-Tucanoan sociality. For the Coteria, with whom I worked for a number of decades, language is not only a system of classification, but a constantial metaphysical product, a substance in the development of the person. Deeply rooted in ontology, language is one of several substances transferred gradually from father to child. In spite of the fact that coterie infants are kept close to their mother's bodies during the earliest years of life, they're actively steered toward their father's language. That language, which I've called a patrilect, is the child's patrimony, their physical and spiritual inheritance. Thus, the same phrase can be used to convey both I am coteria and I speak coteria. In this sense, the child may be said to grow the self through speaking. At adolescence, the child is recognized and marked ceremonially as a person and full member of what anthropologists have called a patrikindred or a sib, called by the coteria the Cordua. According to coteria, members of a Cordua are understood to share a natural connectedness, akin to what Marshall Salins in 2013 called a quality of intersubjective belonging, and what Pitt Rivers in 1973 referred to as consubstantiality. The latter concept extends the idiom of a shared substance that imparts belonging. As a substantial property of the collective, language is one of a number of shared substances, one that attaches the individual to others through a web of relationships. We may say that languages serve in this context as vehicles for the construction of relatedness.
Out a minute.
Oh, okay. The same overarching ontological framework that equates language with corporality and asserts that the Coro constitutes a single shared collective body also precludes marriage between speakers of the same language, a practice that scholars call linguistic exogamy. Returning to Pitt Rivers' discussion of consubstantiality, we find the negative side of the assertion. Quote, people see themselves as mutually related to each other, he wrote, because they share a common substance, and they see themselves as unrelated to those with whom they do not. In this sense, speech defines the communities within which familial sentiments and moral commitments prevail, as well as those communities where they do not. It distinguishes communities that are mine or ours from those that are other. In the Northwest Amazon, maintaining difference through ideological and discursive resources is the project of language. Together, ontological theory, ideology, and sociolinguistic practice work to foreground difference and to conceal similarities. Thank you.
Thank you. That was perfect. Next, then we'll move to Dr. Rosaline Howard at Newcastle University.
Hello, Jenanne. Could I share my screen, please? I see I've been disabled from it at the moment.
I don't know if I can do that now or if I need the People's Crossing live stream to do that.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, I'll manage with that.
Oh, just a moment. Can we get screen sharing?
Could be possible now.
Okay, try now.
Just a minute. I'm sorry. Okay. Can you see that okay? Can you see that all right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Everything looks good.
All perfect.
Thank you. I'll get going. So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this really interesting panel. and it's a real pleasure to respond to Jan's and Demura and Gurney's papers. I'm going to take the approach of providing some empirical evidence and reflections on it as a way of kind of engaging with the ideas put across in those two papers that we've read. So the first, my starting point then is this quotation from Viveros de Castro's article, Cosmological Deixis and Amerindian Perspectivism. The typical, as he says, the typical supernatural situation in an Amerindian world is the meeting in the forest between a man or woman, always on their own, and a being which is seen as, at first, as merely an animal or a person, then reveals itself as a spirit or a dead person and speaks to the man or woman. These encounters can be lethal for the interlocutor who, overpowered by the non-human subjectivity, passes over to its side, transforming him or herself into being the same species as the speaker, dead one, spirit or animal. The one who responds to a you, spoken by a non-human, accepts the condition of being its second person, and when assuming in his or her turn the position of I, does so already as a non-human. So this kind of scenario reveals an interpenetration of ontological perspectives constituted by what we may habitually think of as language, yet a closer look at the evidence demands that we rethink what we understand language to be and that we look closely at how language behaves. The notion of language as languaging and as world-making is productive in this respect. So in my discussion, I introduced the concept of interpellation. You have some definitions here. When the human responds to being addressed as you by the non-human, they subject themselves to that relationship. Were they to keep silent and turn away, the lethal encounter that Viveros speaks of might be averted. My empirical example comes from a story told to me by a Quechua-speaking man resident in the mountain village of Tampamayo. The story deals with a scenario similar to the one described by Viveros. In this performance, the lived world of storytelling is intertwined with the narrated worlds of the story told. Language in its various guises mediates these intertwinings. The narrator tells of the relationship that develops between a man and a spirit woman who inhabits the mountainside where the man chooses to clear a plot of land for cultivation. In so doing, he had not known that about the spirit woman's presence or the fact that he should ask her permission to use the land. So I'm going to focus on the interpellations that appear in the story for what these might reveal about the natures of language and the ways in which languaging makes worlds. Extracts 1 and 2 show how, in the first instance, the mountain woman manifests through sound. The man hears musical noises and cannot discern their origin. I'll leave you to read those two examples, extracts 1 and 2. Moving to extract 3, eventually the mountain woman speaks the man's name, Luis. She offers him gold, which he takes home. Do I have to move this out of the way? Sorry, what can I do with this? Ah, that's better. Sorry. Where am I? She offers him gold, which he takes home. He continues to work her land. At first, she allows him to come and go, taking more gold each time. So moving on then to extract 4. Oh, no, firstly, just to say, the mountain woman's interpellation of the human protagonist by his name, Luis, is a turning point in the story. By becoming the earth being's second person and by taking the gold, the man's human subjectivity is overpowered and he begins to pass over to her side. After that, his wife was sad, extract 4, saying, "My man may be sick, he may be hearing things, maybe the earth has grabbed him, maybe the mountain is playing tricks on him." She had him cured with a medicinal rub. Here, the interaction between human and non-human is
about a minute.
Physical terms, grabbing and tricking. Medicinal practices are a medium through which to counteract the earth's powers. These actions are also interpellations. While not verbalized, should we perhaps consider them as a form of language? When the man goes to work on the mountainside with his wife or taking his dog, there's no intervention from the mountain woman. When he goes on his When he goes on his own, extract 5, she interpolates him again. So when he doesn't take the dog, she's there again, calling out his name, Luis. So from this point on, the story unfolds as a direct exchange between the man and the mounted woman. She keeps giving him gold, and with every visit, draws him further into her world. So the story traces the human protagonist's gradual realization of his process of ontological transformation as his commitment to the mountain world's world intensifies. The narrative marks progressive stages of wonderment, conjecture, supposition, realization, and eventual knowledge as the human to non-human transformation is constituted. So my response to Hauck and De Muro and Gurney is thus an ethnographic demonstration of how storytelling performance reveals the natures or ontologies of language in different behavioral guises, musical signs, sounds of nature, dialogue shaping the story, dissimulation, giving of gold, and interpolations that constitute subjectivities, ultimately dissolving our habitual distinction between human and non-human beings and worlds. Thank you.
Thank you. Next then, sorry, you're still sharing your screen.
No, I know. And
okay, no, I'll just wait for you to
somebody
see that.
Nobody,
in the meantime, we'll get ready for.
I apologize.
Oh, that's okay. Should be able to hit the button right at the bottom for stop sharing.
Yes, I know. It's just that I've got this funny strip. Oh, sorry, up here. Share.
Yeah.
It was at the top. I do beg your pardon.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Next, we'll move over to Dr. Suzanne Oakdale at the University of New Mexico.
Hi, thanks so much, Jan and Jenanne, for pulling this together and doing so much work for so many years. I appreciate being included. I just have a very short, presentation here. So following this roundtable's call to focus on the equivocations between anthropologists guided by Western theories and their interlocutors in their field sites when discussing language, and to think with these equivocations, I suggest that in Amazonia, at least, we focus on commentary about processes that could be thought of as akin to synesthesia, or phenomenon whereby one sensory pathway leads to another, or even in some cases turns into another. The capacity of spoken and sung language for producing synesthesia may be one important axis of ontological linguistic difference in lowland societies anyway, and perhaps beyond. There are many examples of sounds that produce images in lowland ethnographies. Shipibo songs, according to Bernard Breivik de Mori, give rise to the imagery of landscapes. Dasana flutes, which is not language, but close, were described for Reichel Dolmatov as making sounds that are associated with colors, temperatures, and odors. For example, the sound of one large flute had a very yellow color, hot temperature, and male odor. To take examples from the group I know best, the Tupi-speaking Kauiwete of central Brazil, there are several kinds of non-ordinary language that have the effect of producing images or of being perceived through the eyes. A well-told myth can cause images to appear for the listeners as if there was a large television screen in front of them, I was told. Shamanic music in a cure called maracá causes tears in the eyes of the lay audience members because they produce visions of spirits that are so intense and vivid. As participants said, they felt like they had been where the shaman had been and had been going around with him in the spirit world. The shaman's soul, or Ang, actually travels to other domains through this music. Shamans first hear and then repeat songs authored by spirits. This repetition allows them to enter the spirit world and interact with them in order to cure. There are a few important differences between these Amazonian processes and Western ideas of synesthesia. For example, synesthesia-like effects are produced by language itself in lowland society traditions. It's therefore both more widely shared and also learned than in contrast to synesthesia. Synesthesia in the West is commonly understood to be the ability of particular individuals, like Billie Eilish. I mean, you can Google these people. It's like lists of people who are synesthesia capable of this. And the senses produced distinctive to each of them and apparently stable over their life course, so that the same sound produces the same color for these people over the course of their lives. For Kaiwate, it is likely taught in a state of lucid dreaming, as many cures take place overnight, while those who have gathered to watch are actually partially asleep. Shamans learn to do this also in a state of lucid dreaming with their mentors. In thinking about when sound produces images, or perhaps better becomes images, it is in these traditions as cosmological boundaries are crossed. The immaterial sounds of language become material and visible when shamans enter the world of spirits, or when language goes inside the human body. Shipibo's chants are described as becoming tangible objects in other cosmological dimensions, according to Brabeck de Moray again. According to Harry Walker, which was in the readings that you guys suggested for us, these Urarina chants, once whispered into liquids that are then ingested, become dye in the blood, which again is a kind of sound turning to color once a boundary is crossed. It's the boundary of the body that are there. While I did not ask, I did not ask if Maracas songs became a kind of material object in the spirit world. It would be in keeping with the fact that smoke and odors become tangible, substantive food in the spirit world, and the invisible souls of the sick become objects like bird beaks. Likewise, the invisible spirit's projectile points become pieces of bone or teeth or human hair inside the human body. The objectification or making visible may take place mainly as cosmological boundaries are crossed. I would say that the kind of seeing that takes place in these Maracas songs are not marked with evidentials in the same way as firsthand experiences. Rather, they're like dream reporting. They use a non-witness form. So to think in terms of how hearing and language are related to the other senses would involve thinking of language and hearing with respect to sight, taste, touch, and odor. Odor in the lowlands seems a rich avenue for thinking about how now separate domains of the cosmos relate to each other, as odor, like music, calls beings from other spacetimes into the present. It may be that the five bodily senses are actually accompanied by many more senses in these societies, as Fernando Santogranero has pointed out for the Yanesha, to really understand how all the senses relate and how language works with respect to them. One would need to know more about theories of the senses. Given that transformation and oscillation are so highly valued in Amazonia, I call, at least in this area, ethnographic area, for turning to how language itself may not be a stable category, but be just one part in a chain of metamorphoses. Thanks.
Thank you. And now for our last online presenter, we'll go to Dr. Christopher Ball at the University of Notre Dame.
Hi. I also want to thank Jan and Jenanne for sticking with this plan. I'm really happy to be here and super excited listening to everyone's great comments. So I wanted to take cue from one of the claims that Jan starts his article that we read off with, where he says, if linguistic anthropologists have not been interested in an ontological exploration of language, neither have those involved in discussions of ontology, whether proponents of the ontological turn or their critics. So I kind of wanted to decenter the ontological part of the ontological turn and talk about kind of one of the functional goals of that general body of theory, which is a self-proposed symmetrical anthropology. And so what I'm thinking about is thinking less about ontologies of language per se, but maybe thinking as linguistic anthropologists how we can understand what symmetrical anthropology is meant to be within this framework, and how we can contribute through our own studies of language, which are clearly lacking in the OT itself, to think about symmetrical anthropology of language. So people mean different things by symmetrical. I have a kind of rough and ready and probably very oversimplified view of this, but I think for someone like Latour, who's coming from science studies, symmetricalizing anthropology means including actants that are non-human, say microbes and other kinds of beings in networks that collectively contribute to what anthropologists can understand, having erased or kind of worked to elide the boundary between society and nature as an ontological divide. So for Latour, symmetrical means talking about how non-humans participate in human activity. For people like Descola and Viveros de Castro, I think symmetrical anthropology has a kind of double meaning. Part of it is bound up in the history of structuralism and a kind of internal dialogue about the working of sign relations. So I think that they're modeling equivalent over privative relations internal to kind of how OT in that vein is extended structuralism, but also symmetricality for Descola and Viveros de Castro explicitly, they say, includes a political project in which we can engage as European or Northern centered scholars with non-European, non-Northern centered philosophies and ideas, and in turn incorporate the philosophy, the metaphysics of the other into the interior of our own theorization. For scholars like Marisol de la Cadena, I think she's talking about a symmetrical achievement as an anthropological part of fieldwork, so co-laboring together with interlocutors, with subjects in order to reduce apparent inequalities even across communicational divides like literacy and non-literacy. But also there's a metaphysical component to her symmetrical approach in the sense that she's talking about including non-human subjects like earth beings in dialogue as producers of anthropological knowledge in this concept of co-laboring. So I think taken that way, for me, this is the kind of most inspiring and important part of what the ontological turn offers us as a body of work to think with. And I think we have a number of resources at the ready in linguistic anthropology. I represent, or I guess I'm talking from a kind of semiotic perspective, where I explicitly hope to use semiotic tools not to reproduce one ontology under which all communicative systems are regimented necessarily, but to use kind of Eduardo Cohn's notion of an open system provided by a semiotic, non-strictly symbolic, but also indexical and iconic. And I'm trying not to look at the finger too much and miss the moon here. But if we look at different ways of representation, it really, I think, will hopefully help us to be able to achieve symmetry in all of these different ways without necessarily becoming ourselves anti-representationalist. And so for me, I'm trying to think about the spirit of symmetry that the ontological turn is forwarding, but also not following what I see again and again in works by ontological turn scholars, that when they get to not just language representation, they eschew it out of hand as a non-starter. And I don't think as linguistic anthropologists we should take that critique so lightly. I think we need to defend representation, not necessarily by retreating to a narrow definition of it, but by expanding it as scholars like Webb Keen and others have done. Yep, as scholars like Webb Keen and others have done to emphasize semiosis and representation as necessarily material. So hopefully engaging with scholarship that wants to see materiality more directly included in descriptions of language, and also the longstanding tradition in linguistic anthropology of seeing language as representational, not being limited to description, but in fact being largely performative or world building. So for me, I'm really interested in using the tools that we have. I'm happy to explore and adopt new tools from our global interlocutors. But I think using tools that we have at hand, both in kind of in the structuralist tradition and in the semiotic tradition, that seems to me to be the basis of how linguistic anthropologists engage with one another when we talk about language, and extending those tools to our engagements with others and incorporating new tools that we learn about into that. But I think with the spirit, not necessarily of defining ontologies, which seems to be a contentious task, but in some ways achieving symmetry, which I think is something we all agree on. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I will turn things over to Jan to introduce our last two presenters who are joining in person.
Yes, thank you to all the remote presenters, and we'll now turn over the floor to Bernie Perley, first from the University of British Columbia.
First, Sean, how are you doing? Thumbs up? All right. Last winter, I was calling my mother. I call her every Sunday night just to check out how things are back home on the res. And she was telling me the story that she had gone to the band office, and she noticed that the chief was walking across the parking lot as well. And 3 traditionalists saw him, and they approached him. And according to my mother, the 3 traditionalists, they exchanged greetings. Hey, Chief, how you doing? And he said, hey, how you guys doing? And then one of them popped a serious question saying, Chief, do you think we're going to have a cold winter? And okay, now the chief is not necessarily a traditionalist, but he knows this is an important constituency because he's a politician. So what he does is he looks at the sky. He looks at the horizon, he looks at the ground, and then he looks at his 3 interlocutors and he says, yes, it's going to be a cold winter. And so this is when the 3 guys say, well, that's great, what do we do? He says, you should go collect firewood. Now, oh, thank you for that good advice. And they disappear to go collect firewood. So the chief goes home that night and he's wondering, well, what if I'm wrong? What if it's not going to be a cold winter? And so he says, maybe I should get some, advice here. So he calls up the local weatherman and he says, hey, can you tell me whether or not we're going to have a cold winter? And so the weatherman says, yeah, it's going to be cold. In fact, it's going to be very cold. And the chief says, whoa, okay, well, thanks for the information. And so he hangs up. And he's thinking, well, gee, maybe I should tell those guys to collect more firewood tomorrow. And so he sees those 3 guys yet again. He said, hey, guys, remember I told you to collect firewood because it's going to be a cold winter? And they said, yeah. He said, well, it's going to be a very cold winter, so you need to collect more firewood. And so the 3 guys say, okay, well, thanks. We appreciate the advice. And so, again, that evening, the chief goes home, and he's sitting there thinking, what if I oversold this? And so I better call the weatherman again. So he calls the weatherman. He says, can you tell me whether or not it's going to be a cold winter? And the guy says, yeah, in fact, it's going to be a very cold winter. He says, really? And he says, yep. And he says, well, thanks for the information. And so the chief says, I got to tell these guys to collect more firewood. So the next day, these 3 guys appear at the parking lot and he says, guys, got bad news. It's going to be a very cold winter. You got to collect more firewood. And so they said, well, okay, that's good advice, thanks. And they disappear to go collect firewood. And so he gets back home, the chief gets back home, and then his, thinking, he said, I don't know, this doesn't sound right. I think I've oversold this. I better call the weatherman again. And so he calls the weatherman, and the weatherman, he says, hey, are you sure it's going to be a very cold winter? He says, yeah, it's going to be very, very cold. Oh, wow, very, very cold. In fact, it's going to be the coldest winter on record. And so the chief says, oh my God, the coldest on record? How do you know this? He said, the Indians are collecting firewood like crazy. So I told that story to connect the idea of, not necessarily the ontologies approach, but the, the natures approach. Okay, what's the connection between the ontologies and the natures, but also how we think about epistemology. Epistemology, not just a separation of knowledge systems as much as embodiment. And so that embodiment also implicates a particular understanding of ontology. Okay, for the next story, I need to teach you a couple of Maliseet words. Okay, the first word is big say. So everybody repeat, big say. Big say. Everybody in Zoom room, big say.
Big say.
All right, big say.
Big say.
The second word is Delaz. Delaz.
Delaz.
All right. Okay. These two are important words for this next story. Okay, so during the political campaigns, when people are running for office, there are these mixed constituencies in the community. And so there are various degrees of competence in the Maliseet language. And so the politicians know that, and they're trying to indicate particular kinds of constituencies during their political speeches. So one woman, a traditionalist, goes up, and she recognizes that most of the community does not understand Maliseet. And so her campaign speech was really simple. She recognized that there was a community perception that maybe there was some not quite legal practices being exercised, and that she had to call this out. And so what she does is, okay, I'm running for chief. I have a very big, I got to tell you what the words are. Big say, you said the word. That translates loosely as women's genitalia. And the laws translate as underwear. Okay, so this politician goes up there and says, everybody, I'm running for chief. I have a very big say. And it's time to change the laws. So when we think about these two stories as world making, then during the question and answer period, we can talk about these two stories in these 4 and 5 syllable words from Western epistemologies and ontologies, and then we can add the kinds of appropriate descriptors. But for now, what we just did was worlding.
Thank you, Bernie. And, let me.
Let's turn around here.
Okay. And our final presenter is Laurie Graham from the University of Iowa.
Sorry for turning my back on you guys, but I'm wanting to face all of you here in the room. Thanks for coming. I want to thank Jan and Jeanette for continuing, as others have said, to persistently bring many new voices and minds to this discussion over the years. These are very exciting ideas, and it's wonderful to be able to think with an ever-enlarging group, thanks to you two. I think this is bringing a lot of new vitality into our discussions in linguistic anthropology, and it's a project of immense importance. As the last commenter today, I think I have the distinction, or maybe the unfortunate experience of having heard much of what I was going to, or what I have prepared to talk very briefly about, already articulated so well by our other speakers. Or, hopefully I can do justice to bringing some connections to them. So I had the good fortune to be participating in these discussions and in thinking with Jan and others for a number of years now. Was it in 2018 that you had that AAA? 2016, Wow, time flies. I was a discussant for one of two-part sessions that Guilherme Herrick and Jan organized at the AAA. And in discussing those papers I'm not sure that anyone in this group was part of that, but when I was discussing those papers, it seemed to me like the papers were all talking about what we in linguistic anthropology think of as language ideologies. And they were using the term ideology and ontology as interchangeable words. And so in my comments, I tried to push them to clarify how what they were talking about really constituted ontologies rather than ideologies. And I think this is what Paul is speaking to as is ontology really an extension of what we have been thinking about as ontologies? So I had a lot of discussion with Jan and Guilherme as they were preparing the introduction to the language and communication volume, pressing them to clarify that. And also, I think they did a very good job pressing the authors of the papers in that collection to do just that. And they pushed people to think about how is this different? And I want to applaud the efforts in that language and communication volume, and also the pre-circulated papers, especially Jan's pre-circulated paper that he gave to us, and there's a link to here. What's clearly spelled out there in these essays is a move that I think takes us beyond language ideology as linguistic anthropologists have traditionally conceived of it. We can see it as a project of decentering Western concepts of language and really interrogating our ethnographic experience in a new way and being reflexive about our ideas of language that we take to the field and interact with our research subjects about. So the question becomes, are we and our research subjects talking about the same thing when we're talking about language? And what is language for our research subjects? I see this, so Paul emphasized how this is an extension of language ideology discussions, and I see it even going back further, maybe building on what Gumpertz and Himes were doing with the ethnography of communication and the ethnography of speaking. They were attempting, I think, to decenter the nature of language insofar as it had been conceptualized within the Western structuralist paradigm at that time. For them and for us, language doesn't exist as a formal structure, the prevailing ontology of the time. Language is action. Language is ways of speaking and communicating. So I suggest that we go back even farther and situate it in the outgrowth of the ethnography of speaking and communication. And finally, the third point that I want to make very briefly here, and we've had a number of examples in what we've heard from our other commenters, is really thinking about our ethnographic material, and that is, I think, the core of the issue. And so these discussions have brought me to rethink with fresh eyes some of my ethnographic material with the Aume or Xavante people of central Brazil, not too far away from the people that Chris Ball and Suzanne Oakdale are working with. So returning to the Xavante with ontological questions in mind, I find that what I and other ethnographers are thinking about, and what the Aume Xavante are thinking about, what they translate as song and singing is actually language from the point of view of the ancestors or spirits who live in another world. When they sing, they're revoicing the ancestors among the living, and that's a point that I've made earlier. So in thinking about the Xavante examples, I'm extending the earlier observations of expressive forms, and I'm emphasizing that while some forms are referentially diminished, the language of the spirit world is musically elaborated. And I'm inspired by Suzanne Oakdale's observation that referential variance may be a key means of situating humans relative to other beings in a cosmological domains. And also the work of Jonathan Hill and Jean-Pierre Chaumille, who emphasize musicality. And I'm suggesting that in thinking about the ontologies of language, we pay particular attention not only, and also Sean here, we pay particular attention to the importance of musicality, of melody and rhythm, as well as forms of embodiment. In many lowland South American contexts, musicality is the language of other existential domains. And this may be productive for us to take a careful look at the parameters of language and musicality and the ways that they intersect and intertwine, and expand our thinking about musicality in and as language when we're thinking about language as nature. A language musicality continuum that I propose for lowland South America echoes observations that Andrea Luz Gutierrez Chocville, I don't know how you say her name, is that right? She has made this observation for the Andean context, and this may be part of broader aerial linkages between the Amazon and the Andes, and then we're hearing Sean even beyond. So that's what I bring to the conversation today, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Okay, that was the formal part of our roundtable, and I would like now to open the floor, both the virtual floor and the in-person floor here, to your questions, comments, thoughts, and discussion points.
So if anyone online has a particular question, yeah, please put up your hand, yeah, and we can go with you first, Sinfree, if you want to start. If you think of a question while someone else is talking, you can pop it in the chat, and then I'll call on you to elaborate.
Thank you very much for this interesting and fascinating discussion. What I'm going to try and do now is to give what I think I would call an African account of some of these issues. How does an African scholar respond to some of these particular debates? I want to start by talking about the issue that we have discussed to some extent, the issue about musicality. And I want to quote from the work of the Kenyan literary scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And he writes, when he talks about each language having its own musicality. So it was really interesting to hear the notion of language and musicality coming from other different scholars. This African scholar writes, language is like a musical instrument, if you like. We have a piano for reasons, we have a guitar, we have, and what do they call the one they play with strings over their shoulder like this? Oh my, violin. Each of those instruments, whatever their size, whatever their shape, is its unique musicality. We don't ever say that we ban all other instruments or suppress them and have the piano only or the guitar only. But if you're at the colonial process, they tell you, no, there's some languages whose musicality is more musical, etc., etc. In fact, they go ahead and say, no, let's suppress these other instruments and hear only the ones that come from imperial centers. What is interesting here from Ngugi wa Thiong'o is that he's arguing for the importance of retaining and using multiple languages, using the notions of musicality, which have been suggested by a number of other different people. This, I think, is interesting because it shows to some extent that discussions about ontology are overlapping, even if the communities themselves are not, for example, speaking to each other. Then I have a very specific issue that I want to raise. I understand the concerns about trying to draw distinctions between ideologies and ontologies. I appreciate the extent to which there's been an effort to try and separate them, let's say, within the North American Academy. What is always lacking in these discussions is the following question. How are these ideas circulating outside Euro-American Academy? What are the distinctions, if any, which are being drawn between ideologies and ontologies outside Euro-American Academy? I think it is important for us to try and get a sense of how the uptake of these distinctions outside our own immediate small areas of concern. That's my first response. Then I'll get back to the discussions later on. Was in the conversations, I wasn't sure, for example, whether they were talking about ontologies about language or whether these were ontologies about communication, whatever, but that is beside the point at the moment.
Does anyone want to comment further on Sinfree's point? Does anyone have a follow-up or a response to that? Okay, well, we can...
I can give it a try.
Okay.
Maybe because, yeah, thank you very much for your comment and raising the issue of circulation, raising the issue of the ideology, ontology difference that that has come up in some of the contributions as well. So my own thinking about this, and especially also about the question of the relationship of whether we call it natures of language or ontologies, or language ontologies, or any of these terms, I'm not too concerned about the particular label that we give these, sort of what we're trying to get at. And I also agree very much with Chris that we shouldn't immediately throw out the tools that we have and try. And I think in the paper the most recent paper that I circulated, the goal is more of a call of refinement, a call of being not, essentially, I think it's an argument against the a priori, that sort of Jared Zigon has called this in a recent book, the politics of the a priori, which essentially what he means is an a priori understanding of what humanity is, for example, and of what we take, and what I would extend to what we take language to be. So and I think, but that doesn't necessarily, I mean, the language is just a placeholder here. It's not necessarily that we're trying to figure out exactly what language is. But we try to be open that what we think, what we are understanding as language may be otherwise, may be different from our presumptions. And that extends to concepts such as indexicality, for example, which is one of the examples that I've used, that it's of course very easy, and the semiotic approach, precisely because it doesn't make any ontological commitments to a distinction between reality and sort of the material plane and the non-material, is of course very useful for tackling the very same issues that people in the ontological turn have been trying to grapple with, because we're kind of dealing with similar ethnographic material. But the currency that the way in which these terms circulate, whether it be indexicality, whether it be ideology, it seems to me that in many of the discussions, they have a very fixed, already sort of set in stone, an a priori meaning attached to them. And here is where I feel that we should really think with try to come up with ethnographic theories of indexicality, of language ideology, of language, etc. So the one example that I put in the paper, yes, of course, to stress Janet's example from the Upper Rio Negro region, in the Tukanoan context, a Kuchiria boy may index his identity or his belonging to his sib by a particular way of speaking, just as someone in California or elsewhere may index his identity. But when we analyze particular linguistic acts in this way, then we seem that we already know what indexicality. We have already made our minds about what indexicality is. We already have it sort of set in stone with the kind of framework, within the frameworks that we're working on. And here I would like to kind of pause and think, well, these two things may not necessarily be exactly the same thing.
Great, thank you. I see that Sean wrote in the chat that he has a follow-up to continue this on. Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry there. Ironic for a linguistics conference. Could you get my body language? Anyway, so we've been talking a lot about the West versus the rest in that kind of framework, but it's important to remember here that the West did not invent linguistics any more than we invented algebra, the Fibonacci series, or all sorts of the printing press, all sorts of other stuff. And that's why in my paper I was trying to invoke the Arabic tradition, the Indian tradition. The Indian is one that's the oldest one on the planet that's in literature, Panini and so forth. And I was giving you some ideologies and some actual ontologies into your ground of being, spirituality. I think we might want to engage with that more as this kind of movement. And anthropology in general, I think, needs to recognize these other intellectual traditions that very often go way back farther than anything we can trace from the Greeks or the Romans, like in the history of math, for example. And on that note, I remember talking to Michael Silverstein about this one time. I wish I had the documentation for it, but he told me that Leonard Bloomfield himself, not in print, acknowledges a great debt to the Indian linguist Panini, which is where we get a lot of the structuralism and some of these, but there's a lot more philosophy in there. And that note, going beyond just ontology, we might talk about, that's just one branch of philosophy, linguistic philosophies. And that could also include semiotics, all these other things, where they're all an assemblage, the whole philosopher's handbook. So that's one thing I was thinking there. But there's also Egyptian traditions in linguistics. They're all over the planet. And a lot of those are very much engaged with music. Definitely, they were transcribing music, they were the Quran and so forth. But a lot of that is not just transcribed, it's passed on from heart to heart over one generation to the next. And there's some exquisite semantic work in those areas and ideologies, ontologies, again, those kind of things. So that's something to think about, but I'm not prepared to answer all that. And then the other one I wanted to follow up on a bit was the polyglossia point, which Bakhtin mentions, and it comes down to, multilingual consciousness, how that shapes your being in that kind of sense. And then I was going to connect that to the idea of musicality, because you could easily say there's a kind of multi-musicality going on in many of these multilingual communities, which is probably a great fraction of humanity throughout our history, and that we need to account for. So, and then on those grounds of the multi-musicality, the polyglossia, the question for us is, how does it shape your ground of being? I know, I'll give you one example for Northern California, which I didn't really mention here much. There's a story that Sapir took down where Sam Brown, one of the Hupa speakers he was working with, describes the Hupa speaker in a particular text. It doesn't mean in all cases in everyday life, that the language was seen as a spiritual presence, and it was making you part of a spiritual community. The ancestors can hear you. That's why you don't say the name of the dead. All of divinity can hear you, and therefore, since there's different spiritual presences, you don't, for example, speak Hupa on the coast. I had a speaker tell me about that one time. The ocean will rise up and sweep you away, and it's jealousy of the great power of speech, which emerges from the water like King Arthur's sword, I guess. I mean, there's all these really fascinating cases where that's one of the most interesting things. There is a mixedness of language, and then on the synesthetic point, I wanted to point out, I read some recent neuroscience where basically that's probably how we lay down those silver screens in our mind. We're all wildly synesthetic early in life. That's according to Oliver Sacks. And then maybe it drifts away a little bit. It just stabilizes with other people. But that's a really interesting process. I mean, we got a language, we're kind of all synesthetic up to a point. But Bakhtin would always talk about the aroma of language and that kind of stuff. So it's all the sense, it's not just vision. And then that's why this is kind of this full-bodied experience. And then I think we might want to look more to contemporary neuroscience. We don't need to cite it or anything, but a lot of linguistics is inspired by 19th century. Left brain, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, they knew about that a long time ago. And a lot of our models are very focused on that, not the whole brain lighting up as it does with music or with poetry or these fuller expressions of language. And in that sense, we can have some support from the West. That's one of the things Boas used to do, was say, hey, these are not just, fanciful ideas. These have some real truth to them, and we could all stand to learn something from them. So those are just a few comments in general that they're all worth following up on. Definitely don't have the answers. So anyway, okay, see you in a minute.
Thank you. And I see that in the, if you haven't looked in the chat, that Sinfree also added a comment as well. Did you want to expand on that any further, Sinfree, or leave it with what what you've written there?
We can't see it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll
okay. What I wanted to do was just to reinforce the arguments about the influence, at least from where I stand, of the, let's say, other traditions, the global Southern traditions on North American scholarship. The impression I get, having lived both in the United States and in Africa, is that the insights about language practices, multilingualism, etc., that scholars who are based here get from their work when they get, let's say, into Africa. They attribute that to field work, as opposed to talking about the other African traditions of language and linguistic analysis which exist. It's easier to say it's field work because then you then are not held responsible for giving credit to the individuals whose insights have shaped your thinking. So field work then becomes, to me, a dirty word because it's simply a careful way of concealing the source of your ideas, particularly if they come from the global South and other Southern epistemological fields. Then the other point I was trying to make is that for me, language is whatever it is. In some cases, it may include music, and I completely agree with the idea of language and talking to spirit mediums, your ancestors, etc. Given my own personal background, I don't draw any distinctions between interacting with, let's say, my spouse and interacting with my spouse, with my ancestors. It's only when I shifted into linguistics that I realized that no, you can't talk about interacting with your spirit mediums and your spouses. But any African scholar would tell you that interactions with your spirit mediums is an integral part of your universe. So what I'm interested in such cases are the ontologies of my interaction with my spirit mediums who are part of my intellectual anchorage.
Did anyone want to follow up again on that? We have, it looks like about 5 minutes left. So if anyone else wants to follow up on Sinfree's point again, or wants to say any further points based on what we've now had a chance to talk about and hear everyone else say, please go ahead.
I've got a question that actually, is completely related to Sinfree's point here. I'm thinking, listening to all of this wonderful work that you're all doing, and thinking about a couple of things. Thinking about what Bernie said about deeds, the role of linguistic anthropology, and action. Thinking about the work of folks like Isaiah Wilner and Audra Simpson, and thinking about also Sinfree's point just now of sort of this history and anthropology of the process of sort of doing field work and imagining the knowledge happening in the field workers' hands of like, look what I discovered in this sort of transfer of knowledge and problematics, and also thinking about, a lot of what has come out with Franz Boas, these conflicts around Franz Boas lately of if we imagine his work as ontological and epistemological, then it seems radical. But if we remember the role of political economy, which Audra Simpson points out so beautifully in her work, she has, her article, for example, Why White People Love Franz Boas. There's sort of, the whole picture looks different. And so I'm wondering, for all of you doing this work, what is at stake? So if we're trying to go beyond learning things from our field work and then bringing it into this, the benefit being in the field of the academy, like we now know all these new things that we didn't know and we can further theory. What's at stake for folks? And I can, I hear Sinfree talking about this a bit in terms of colonial legacies and language practice, but I'm wondering what else might be in some really material ways, or thinking about structural oppression, or thinking about what life does this have besides informing our academic, luster or whatever. Thanks.
In my area, this is directly related to restoring these legacies in communities, which is the bulk of the work. This stuff we do outside the academic, and taking languages this seriously, not just as grammars and dictionaries, but as embodied performances with spiritual meaning, is a useful paradigm. And in a lot. And by the way, that's exactly how Panini looked at it in India. He was preserving the texts of Hinduism and Buddhism for spiritual purposes, and so forth. So that's my 2 cents on that one.
And I was just going to say the exact same thing. I think that in contexts of language maintenance and language revitalization or language revalorization in communities where there are Indigenous and minoritized languages, taking language very seriously from the point of view of the speakers or the would-be speakers is really important, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done in again valorizing language and making or allowing people to state what language is for them, and what language can and should do in the world. And that involves understanding that, language isn't just, perhaps the way it's often coded in Western academia as just another resource or just a tool that does, X and Y, but rather it's something that's fundamentally part of a way of being in the world, which is why I really like what Demaro and Gurney have to say about worlding and creating worlds and understanding other worlds. And it really goes hand in hand, I think, for at least the people that I work with seeing their language as something to value and something to continue speaking. So that would be, I guess, I think I'm thinking along very similar lines as Sean with the utility of, why we need to think about these kinds of things. And I'm torn. It's interesting, like after writing about it myself a bit a few years ago, I started to wonder too, it's like, do we need to use the word ontology? Is it really a separate thing that we think it is? So I appreciated Paul's comments on that, because I've certainly second guessed, exactly how we should talk about it. But I do think it's something that's really important to talk about, because it allows us a way of, seeing things rather maybe than through our lenses, but other people's lenses, and understanding those important distinctions in what, people say. And I think that, as Paul just wrote in the chat, Indigenous languages are not just what UNESCO says they are, or endangered. So we need to go beyond those kinds of definitions. And I think that this kind of thinking perhaps allows us a way to do that.
I would just add one more thing to this, because I totally agree with what's been said so far. In the case that I work with, part of the embrace of ethnographers or outsiders in general is part of what I've called existential recognition, and that is part of that is being known, getting known to the outside, but it's not just being known like we are here, it's we have something to contribute to humanity. They're part of the humanities, and this is how we think about language, or, you know, we have this contribution to make. So I think that's important to remember, and especially as peoples that we work with are getting more and more control of their own means of communication and being able to project their own image and views of the world out there. But we are also important vehicles of that, not just authenticating that, but we are vehicles. We're instruments for the transmission in ways that perhaps at this point they don't have access to, but maybe they will, and they want to be known in these worlds in these ways.
A little moment. So I really appreciated Sinfree's points here, because when I came into linguistic anthropology in 2007 for my BA, and then moved on to all through the PhD, and it was very assaulting to understand that language could be reduced in my personal life history to resources or a register or even a belief. And it was this thing where I had attended to it as a very small child because it was told to me that it was a very powerful action, and that the things that I could do with my words could create a whole new world. And I remember my father, he's from Trinidad and Tobago, and he would tell me, you know, you would go to school to learn the system, not to believe in it. And then off I went. And it was a very early thing, it was a mantra of power in the family and in the house. And a lot of Black children have that, because the system there, what you perceive, will destroys your mind, destroys you, because the language kills your world. And that was very early on in my family house, to make very clear that the language you're receiving and learning, don't accept it. You must learn the game, but you don't believe in the game. So it's a very normal thing in Black households in the United States. Otherwise, it kills you. This place will kill you. So the world that you're making, and then what language is always, I always tended to it almost like spells, I would say. You're casting spells in the world. And so when I did my fieldwork in northern India, and then encountering concepts like mantras or things like that, I was like, okay, that's a different, that felt so much more at home to what the world, what I can do. So the way that I speak and how I move and all of those things are always creating different spheres. And then you're entering into different worlds. And so the code switching concept actually really felt the most powerful, that you're entering, if you're a gamer, I'm not, but the idea that you can enter into new worlds, and then you just kind of switch in and out, and then that allowed that type of mobility. So I really appreciate this discussion, to be thinking really critically about how we're doing it and how worlds we avail to our undergrads, because a lot of these concepts, though they can help attend to how to move in the academy and how we might want to transform these things, there is an assault that happens when undergrads from different types of communities that think about how you build a world, and how language, how you speak, how you communicate, how your comportment, what you're wearing, all these things that create certain spaces. It can really, I think in terms of the stake, what's at stake is what I'm trying to get at, is the way that we change and accept or reject certain world-making models. That's what's really is at stake, is how our undergrads, and then how we can produce things, and the children's books that get written, and how people and children see themselves in the worlds that they end up creating. I've cast so many spells. I've made so many things happen. I'm like, oh, I just said that a week ago, and now here it is. My husband, Jan is my husband. And so, I always telling him the magic that I've been making and implementing. And, it's very specific to the Caribbean as well. So, I think that there's a lot to toggle with here. So what's at stake is really empowering and making new magic happen in this globe, which is, as it is dying, and we need new spells. That's okay, that's a personal story, but here you go. Okay.
Okay, I think those are good words of closing, and I know we're already out of time, but thank you all for coming, and thanks especially to the presenters for your input, both here in the room and virtually around the world in different time zones. Thank you all for being here. And yeah, if you want to stick around, those here, and chat, please do so. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of the conference or rest of your day or night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have to debrief. I want to hear what you say. Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much, all. This